Well, welcome to DW Documentaries, the documentary YouTube channel of the German international broadcaster Deutsche Welle. And welcome to our panel discussion about the current situation and conflict in Sudan. Over 150,000 people have been killed in the fighting so far. More than 500,000 children have died of malnutrition, and over 15 million people have fled the country or are displaced inside the country. The UN has called it the world's largest humanitarian crisis on Earth right now. But the civil war and the suffering have received quite little international attention so far. DW has co-produced, together with the German channel ZDF, the film A Hospital in the Shadow of War, which was released recently to shed light on the struggles of a hospital in the Nuba Mountains in the southern part of Sudan and the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in the country. In the next 90 minutes, we want to discuss about the humanitarian situation in Sudan, but also explore what lies behind the devastating conflict. Who is fighting and what for? What are the interests of foreign powers in this conflict? What further consequences might the civil war in Sudan have also for us, as far away as it seems sometimes? And are there any chances for peace in the foreseeable future? Before we start, I want to briefly introduce our guests and experts to the topic today. I welcome Kholoud Khair. Kholoud is a Sudanese researcher and political analyst. She is the founder and director of the Sudanese Think and Do Tank Confluence Advisory, which focuses on peace and security, economy and governance. Welcome. A very warm welcome to Naba Mohideen, who is the only one on the panel right now who is in Sudan. Naba is a Sudanese journalist who reported in the past years for several news outlets and works now for the broadcast news agency Feature Story News. Kyle McNally, who works as a humanitarian affairs advisor for the international medical humanitarian organization Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. He was working in countries like Russia, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan, where he was in 2023 and 2024. Then we have Hajouj Kuka, who is a Sudanese filmmaker and journalist, but also active at the Sudanese Emergency Response Rooms, a community-led initiative that was formed by the resistance committees or neighborhood committees who were behind the uprising against longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir at the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019. And last but not least, the filmmakers of A Hospital in the Shadow of War, Laura Salm-Reiferscheid and Karl Giersdorfer. Karl is a biologist, journalist and documentary filmmaker. He was filming in the past years in several African countries, amongst them in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Liberia, Cameroon, also in Peru, in Ukraine, and in Sudan. Laura Salm-Reiferscheid is a freelance journalist and author based in Austria, focusing on global health and social and environmental issues around the world. Thank you for all being here. And thanks to our audience for attending the discussion. In case you, the audience, have any questions to our panelists here, feel free to write them in the comments on this section, and we'll try to discuss as many as possible of them. My name is Thomas Hasel. I'm working for DW Documentaries, and I'm happy to have you all here. So my first question would go to Laura and Karl, who were doing the film. How did you have the idea to do a film about this topic, and how was it to go there? What was the challenges for you?
I think, Karl, you start with the idea, no?
Well, it all started more than a year ago. Sudan was in the news, but it wasn't enough in the news. So I was thinking about ways how to get there. And for journalists, Sudan is an exceptionally difficult country to access and to work in, especially the way we work in, because we don't do news. So we go to a place and we try to stay several weeks on the ground. In fact, we stayed for 2 months in the Nuba Mountains. So that makes it very hard because you attract a lot of attention and you have to rely on a sort of infrastructure that not only gets you there, but supports you there. So I've been soaking up information, and I was reading several articles as well, amongst them in the New Yorker and in the New York Times. I saw pictures from photographers who were there. And several of them entered the country via the south, so via South Sudan, going north. And they were reporting from the southern part, from South Kordofan, from the southern part of Sudan, from refugee camps there, etc. Because a lot of people, and we can go into more detail later, were fleeing south because it was relatively calm and stable at the time. Now, incidentally, it was always mentioned that there was a hospital there that was run by German doctors. I kind of knew the NGO because it's quite well known in Germany, and I contacted the administration of the hospital in Cologne, and I asked them whether it would be possible to visit the hospital and whether they could assist us in getting there. And they immediately agreed, and then Laura and me decided to go. It was postponed for a while because we started our planning, as I said, more than a year ago, I think in July 2024. Now there's the rainy season in this part of the country, which makes it extremely difficult to get there. And so our journey, we then left in October because the rainy season was a little bit extended last year. It went on for a little bit longer. And I leave it up to Laura to explain how we got there, because it's not only, you see it at the beginning of the film, not only in a way adventurous to get there, but I think it also has quite a significance in terms of humanitarian aid, because it's extremely difficult to get there. I mean, anything which wants to enter the country via that route, by road, and of course, nothing can be delivered by plane, is very, very difficult.
Before I give the word to Laura, maybe we can show briefly the map of where exactly where the hospital around is. You see down there Kauda, which is not so far away from it, and you see Sudan. So it's very close to the border to South Sudan. And
yes.
We talk a bit later about
it's close, and we have to keep in mind it's a very big country, and so from the southern Sudanese border to the place where we were, it's less than 200 kilometers, and it took us 2 days. Laura can go into detail.
Yeah.
But Laura, maybe also you can explore a bit, explain to us what is the humanitarian situation there? What did you find there?
Well, when we were there, it was, as Carl already said, it was it was stable, the situation. I mean, the peace situation was stable. There was no active fighting in the area where we were. But the problem was because of a lot of refugees came from the north, came into the Nuba Mountains, into that region. And the year before, there was a bad harvest because the rain season didn't come. So that meant there was just not much food. And the local population, as is custom there anyway, shared all their food with the people who came in, with the refugees who came in, and took them in and gave them plots to harvest, etc. But it was the rain season. So in the rain season, if there's no food, then there's no way that people get food in. And there's only this one way from South Sudan. So if that road is closed because the rain is so bad, there's no way that food aid can come in. I mean, when we were there, they started doing food drops, but that's also, questionable how well that worked. And so it's basically the worst situation was that there was, just a shortage of food. And then after the rain season, so it's very difficult for us also to understand. I mean, when we were there, after the rain season, suddenly the fields were full of vegetable, of food. The harvest was, everything was in bloom, etc. But of course, that was only a short relief, because then the next rain season come and you still have to feed so and so many more people because of all the refugees that came in. So that was really difficult. That what you could see in the hospital also was a lot of malnourished children. And adding to this is, of course, you have the diseases. So the children don't die of hunger, but they die of the combination of worms, of malaria, of hunger, and that combination is really fatal, and they have no chance or very little chance to recover from that. So that was the situation we found there.
A question to Hajouj. You know the area very well, the Nuba Mountains and southern Kordofan. What is the situation right now? Is it still quite stable? Because in the past, also this area was very conflicted. Why?
Okay, so when Carl and Laura went there, the war had been started in Khartoum and it went to Darfur, and actually the Nuba Mountain was a refuge, and that's why you had a huge number of people who went there, and that's why there was this huge need for support. It's an area that normally depends on everybody farming. Like everybody in Nuba, 95% of the people there farm. So when you had this big influx from people who are coming from the urban areas and cities who don't know how to farm, that caused this whole need for aid. And at that time when they went, it was a stable area because the war was in those areas. Unfortunately, right now, the war has spread. In Khartoum was taken over by SAF. It's now quieter and safer, and also Al Jazeera. And now the war is in the Kordofan, it's the front lines. So the front lines of the war right now, you'll find it in the Kordofans and in northern Darfur. That's where there's a lot of active fighting going on. And right now, as we talk, there's 2 cities that are besieged in the Nuba Mountains. They're a little bit outside the area of the SPLM, but the SPLM is partially part of the forces trying to take it over, which is Kadugli and Delenj. And there's starvation IPC level 4 and 5 right now over there.
Short question, because you mentioned this militia or this group SPLM. What is it?
So SPLM, and you see that in the film. So the SPLM, they're Sudanese People Liberation Movement and army, and they used to be part of the SPLM in South Sudan that took over and now are ruling the country. And they used to be under the same flag. And after the separation in 2011, and this is really important, the war that in the Nuba Mountains started. So after the separation, where South Sudan became a country, the war started, and since then they have never stopped that war. There's times during the transitional period where the war has reached a transitional period and there was no fighting going on, but they always maintained their army, and they were always outside of this. So when this war started between the other two, between the militia, the RSF and SAF, they were out of it, and they did not. It took them a very long time before they took obvious sides in the war.
We will shed a bit more light in a second about who is who and who of these groups are fighting for what. But you mentioned Darfur, and Kyle, you were in Darfur last year. There, the situation right now seems to be very tricky, very dangerous, very violent. Can you tell us a bit about the humanitarian situation and the situation in general in Darfur?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and thanks a lot for having me today. I mean, I think it's an important starting point to emphasize that this humanitarian crisis and emergency really is countrywide. It's across the entire country, but in the Darfur states is where we see some of the most pressing concentrations of pressing needs, and especially those that remain unmet or very difficult to reach, given insecurity, physical barriers, but especially the obstruction that we experience from both warring parties in trying to mobilize a response. It's really hard to overstate the level of destruction that we saw when we re-entered Darfur to try to see where we can lend some assistance and try to help the health system get back on its feet. You know, ranging from, of course, the destruction of upwards of 70+% of hospitals have been destroyed or partially destroyed by violence. But it's not only the hospitals that we see impacted, it's also the water and sanitation systems, any kind of water system that people depend on. And it's also other essential services that people depend on in order to survive. And what we have seen over the last couple of years is a very difficult process of trying to get any of these systems back up and running. So we have millions of people still caught in a humanitarian crisis that is largely unattended to by the largest, most capable agencies within the UN system or the broader humanitarian sector. So across the board, primary and secondary health is suffering significantly. Famine conditions in parts of Darfur and significant levels of moderate and severe acute malnutrition. Unrivaled levels of sexual violence that we see, significant numbers of maternal mortality. I could go on and on, but across both primary and secondary care, we see a complete collapse of the healthcare system, and it's the people of Sudan that suffer as a result.
Okay. Kholoud, I hope you can hear me because we had before some connection problems. Why is Darfur such a conflicted area? Why all this violence? What are the groups fighting for? Plus, and can you please tell us a bit, who are these groups? RSF, Rapid Support Forces, the regular army? Who is behind that?
So, I mean, there are a multitude of different actors in Darfur, and to really figure out what's going on, it's a question of how far back do you want to go. But if we go back to the 80s, where real climate change and desertification starts to take root, and it puts farmers who are sedentary and who, sort of farm the lands and who identify as African, and pastoralists who move from place to place for grazing for their cattle and who identify as Arab, it puts them in direct conflict with each other. Originally, they were, because there was plenty in terms of land, in terms of, sort of good weather that would make for good seasons, you had a sort of working relationship between the two. And actually, these African and Arab identities were not as hard and fast. They were not as entrenched, and they were not as rigid. And you also had, of course, the fact that you have a central government in Khartoum that has always marginalized the people of Darfur, whether Arab or African. And that increased the level of sort of resources, the level of conflict over resources, because of how scarce they were. So the story of Darfur is really a story of scarcity and plenty. It's a story of decades of marginalization and very few rights afforded to people of Darfur by the government, by successive governments in Khartoum, and governments in Khartoum also arming different groups in Darfur, particularly the Arab pastoralist groups, arming them to fight its wars in Darfur. So 20 years ago, everyone will remember the Darfur genocide. You really had the Bashir regime at the time push this policy for years and years of arming the Arab pastoralist groups, who became known as the Janjaweed, or the devil on horseback, in order to fight the Khartoum's wars against rebel movements in Khartoum, who became rebels because they wanted to press for more rights, because they wanted to press for more freedoms. 20 years later, it's a very different story. The main Janjaweed group that was fighting on behalf of Khartoum has now been refashioned into the RSF, brought into the center, brought into Khartoum by Omar al-Bashir, made into a regular force by an act of parliament in 2017. And that has now sort of rebelled, if you will, against the central state. And the Darfuri groups, the African groups who had been denied rights and access to services for decades, have now been split. Some of them have sided with the RSF, which has styled itself as the heroes of the periphery, and some of them have sided with the Central Army, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, who styles itself as sort of the liberator of Khartoum, of Sudan. Of course, neither the nor the RSF have a very good history in Darfur, and both have previously led the genocide, various rounds of killing, and the genocide of 20 years ago. So you have a myriad of different groups. Amongst them is one particular group called the Sudan Liberation Movement, or SLM, under Abdel Fattah, and that has never signed a peace agreement, so has never been brought into the fold like some of the other Darfur armed groups have. And he and his group still maintain some level of independence. And the area that he controls, and sort of the central part of Darfur, and the main city there, Tawila, is actually now the sort of the locus of a lot of the famine that we're seeing, and a lot of the displacement of people coming out of Al-Fashir, going in, that's the capital of North Darfur, going into Tawila, which has swelled the numbers of people in Tawila. So we're seeing huge numbers of displaced. We're seeing famine figures in Tawila also go up markedly. We're seeing cholera rates also go up very, very sharply. And this is even before the flooding season. So with the flooding season expected anytime now until at least September, October, we're expecting those cholera figures to go up as well. It's a very desperate situation for people in Darfur who, with the announcement of this new RSF government, which pulls together some of these loyal armed groups in Darfur, and also some of the other ethnic constituencies in Western Sudan, there's no sense of what kind of plan they will have to respond to the famine and the cholera. And there's also been very little sort of promised by the government run by the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is stationed all the way in the east on the Red Sea in Port Sudan. And so the people in Darfur have effectively been displaced, sometimes twice, sometimes thrice. Over the period of 20 years, some people who are now adults have been born into displacement because the issues of 20 years ago have never been resolved. But chiefly here, I think the issue of Darfur, which seems to be a perennial issue, is that impunity for past crimes, particularly for the genocide of 2003 to 2005, have never been dealt with. And that impunity has fed a lot of the readiness to commit atrocities that we see today, not just in Darfur, actually, but all across Sudan.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can briefly look at the map again one more time to show the audience where Darfur is. And also maybe you can briefly explain the red part of Sudan, let's say, and the blue part. So what is that? What RSF is who again? And the regular army is red. Okay. So
sure. So
what was RSF before? Yeah.
So the red parts of this map are areas that are controlled by the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF. They have created a new administrative capital in Port Sudan when they were forced to flee Khartoum in the first weeks of the war, when the RSF took over Khartoum and other parts of the central regions such as Jazeera State and Sinnar State. But since March of this year, the Sudanese Armed Forces has taken back Sinnar, Gadaref, and Khartoum states, and so now we see that they've expanded their control, particularly in the center. This has pushed the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, back into the western part of the country, so into that blue area, and the RSF are still trying to control far more of Darfur in the west there than they currently are, and trying to take them away from, trying to take territory away, not just from the Sudanese Armed Forces, but also from the joint forces, which are groups made up of former Darfur rebels, here seen in the yellow zones. In the yellow zones surrounded by the blue, I should say, in the west of the country. So you have, as you can tell, multiple armed groups playing out in different areas, each with different sort of end games, each with different trajectories for getting into this war. Some of them had maintained neutrality, some had not. The RSF started off, as basically an ethnic militia that had then become sort of the Praetorian Guard for the Bashir regime. Bashir brought them into the center in order to, safeguard his regime from enemies both within his government and his Islamist regime, as well as outside of it. But when the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the head of the Rapid Support Forces dislodged Bashir in 2019, after sort of months and months of popular revolution, they now started to jostle for power between themselves. And so the RSF's position, the position of its head, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, universally known as Himeti, was very much, a triumphant engagement in the center, but that was not, that didn't last very long when he and the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Abdel Fattah, started to fall out after their coup in 2021. So what we have in Sudan effectively is, 30 years of autocratic rule in which we saw a lot of these armed groups come into being in Darfur, followed by a revolution to oust Bashir and his regime, that was followed by a short transitional period that was then upended by a coup led by the RSF and the SAF, unable to reconcile that coup and what they wanted to do after they took over, or violently took over from civilians in government. They were then led straight into sort of an open confrontation in Khartoum, mostly over sharing resources, sharing power, and the question of integrating the RSF into the armed forces.
Thank you. Naba, finally to you. You're the only one who is right now in Sudan. So I would like to know if you can share where you are and how the situation is. Is it dangerous where you are? Your microphone, please.
Actually, right now I am in Port Sudan and I have been there for almost 2 years. When the war started, I moved to Al Jazeera State, and before RSF took over Al Jazeera State, we moved again to Port Sudan to cover the war from a relative peaceful place or safe place. Right now, I can't say Port Sudan is 100% safe, because recently, with the escalation of the war and with the drone attacks, representing a new stage, a new phase of the Sudanese war. There is no a safe place, and this is a message maybe by RSF and their supporters, so that there is no safe place for the Sudanese people to stay in. We saw many drone attacks in Port Sudan in last May, and before that, River Nile State was attacked many times. There is new attacks on power infrastructure, water plants, and civilian infrastructure. So I can't say if it's 100% safe place, but it's a relative safe place, and it's there is kind of, or we can say there is means of life there. There is kind of means of life, like you can have internet, you can have power, even if there is a struggle with power. Sometimes you can have water. You can do all of your procedures if you want to issue a passport or something like that. So life is here is better than many other regions that was ruined by the war. So it's a relative safe, but it's not 100% safe, just like elsewhere in the country. But of course, it's we can't compare it to the hot spots right now or war zones like Kurdufan and Darfur, which is under besiege, and the escalation there is on a daily basis.
In 2018, 2019, when we saw picture the news of a democratic movement, a protest movement that demanded the end of dictator Omar al-Bashir, who was for 30 years in power, there seemed to be hope in Sudan for a change to maybe civilian, more democratic rule. Was there real hope, or I mean, was there any chance to reach that, and why did it end?
Actually, yes, I was there into 2018 and 2019, and I have been seeing and watching and experiencing all of the stage of the uprising against al-Bashir. It succeeded in removing or taking al-Bashir from office, and people dreamt about new Sudan, a new change, and of course, a democracy that was stolen in a day and a night. But let me tell you that what happened in 2018 and 2019, it's conflicted right now, because some people feel and think it's a real uprising against the autocratic rule of al-Bashir and his regime. But other people believe it's kind of a planned, if we can say, a planned uprising, just like what happened in the Arab Spring elsewhere in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, and in Yemen. So as a result of that, after the situation worsened, after the coup in 2021, and then the war that erupted in 2023, people right now believed, like large population of people who went against al-Bashir in the streets, believe that it's part of a conspiracy that want to change Sudan in a way or another. Some people believe that the dream of the democratic change, it was just illusion. I'm not talking about the youngest people who went to the streets and who stayed there for 55 days and who were killed and who were protested around the military headquarters. But I'm talking about a large population of Sudanese people right now. Their priorities have changed, totally changed, to return to their homes, to seek safety, to at least have basic things like food, education, security. So it's really frustrating to see that people priorities have changed, but in the context of the conflict, in the context of what's behind RSF and what they are planning to do, and what happened to Sudan that is putting the country on the brink of the collapse, I can see that why people are changing or they are changing their priorities right now. So there is still hope that the path for democracy will not, of course, it will be longer, but it's not impossible. But right now, the priorities for people, for the Sudanese people at least, who are still in the country, is to sustain security, to go back to their homes and normal lives, and then they believe that maybe the change will come next.
Hajouj, what do you think about the potential of of a democratic movement? Does it still have a future for the foreseeable future, or do you think the war destroyed all these kind of hopes?
Okay, I mean, for me, it's very different. Yeah, of course, there's hope. Right now, as we talk, and we have somebody from MSF, we have a group from MSF who are visiting one of the projects that the emergency response room did in South Darfur. And they basically managed to install this huge number of solar panels to allow the system of Niala to work. And it's impressive. I'm still shocked. They managed to raise $150,000, like a few dollars at a time from different NGOs and from the diaspora and whatnot. And they put the project together, and it is shocking what they're able to do. And they're able to do this beyond RSF controlling the area, beyond the bombing, beyond this war going on. They're still able to do this. And the reason they're able to do this is the group that you're talking about when al-Bashir collapsed. So the idea that we didn't do anything is not true. So the second day after the war started, there was all this talk that Sudan cannot be reached. There's no access. There's no humanitarian aid, and the Sudanese people were able to provide humanitarian aid from the beginning. In the beginning, it was the diaspora providing the money, and then people on the ground who are actually trying to feed, trying to do things and stuff like that. So stuff like the emergency response rooms, which started this whole structure where right now we have 26,000 coordinators on the ground in different areas throughout Sudan. They're working. We have a kitchen running now in Kadugli that is completely surrounded by RSF and SPLM, and no people can move in or out. And the cost of prices went really hiked up, but we're able to run a communal kitchen over there. We're able to run projects in the northern state. We're able to run projects in places where the new militias that weren't even mentioned, the militias from the Islamic side, hate us and trying to stop us from working. Like al-Burhan and whatnot. So this group is able to do it. And the way they govern themselves is very interesting because they govern themselves in a democratic way. They all the lessons they learned, all the ambitions they had of having a Congress, people's movement, of distributed governance where people in the area decide what they want to do. They actually implemented this on how they're working. So they're working by neighborhood level, and the neighborhood level decides what's going to happen. All that just to say that it's not just a hope or a dream, it's something that's happening on the ground. And I think what happens with revolutions is once you start having this idea and you start understanding what governance is and democracy, and I want to have a say, and I have agency, that never is taken away. So what happens during the revolution stays, and eventually, it doesn't matter what happens in Sudan, we're going to move somewhere. And right now in Sudan, the difference between Sudan and other places, you heard so many names. And that's what's confusing in Sudan. But because there's so many names, there's always so many opinions. There's always so many people involved. It's never, right now, who's ruling Sudan? Every single area, you just start moving and it's going to be a different group. There's this, there's that, and another. So it's such a complicated thing, but there's a lot of conversations happening. I think it's going to take a while. I think it's going to be really hard. And I think what Khulud has been saying about immunity, and in the past, I think that was the biggest problems, that there was no accountability. And I think that's something we all realize, but we also realize that whatever treaty that's going to be signed right now is going to actually let them get away. But we have to find ways to do that in the future. So democracy, civilian rule, allowing us to talk, and we're not going to stop talking. I mean, a lot of us will be exiled for a long time because of that. But I think when you say hope, there's no way but to continue this. And I think there's a lot of hope. I'm working with people who are amazing, so I have a lot of hope for them. And I think within the Sudanese civil society, and that's something that is very important, is very strong. The Sudanese civil society is not like other countries. It's really strong. It's really established. It's been fighting for 30 years and before, and they've found ways to continue teaching and growing. And the numbers of the Sudanese civil society that are working right now is huge. And that's why we can have local experts who can go in a lot of depth. Like Khulud saying, where do you want to start? Oh, let's start only from the 80s. But we have all that knowledge and all that trials. And I think eventually we'll get somewhere. We did it once, I think, with the short transitional period was amazing. Like I was there, everybody was there, and I think it wasn't just hope. We actually got there, but then we were fought, and it was removed from us for a lot of different complicated reasons of what Sudan is, and it's not just because of us as a country. I mean, whenever you have revolutionary ideas and people are trying to do something, you need time and you need space to work, and you're living in a world that doesn't give you that.
We have questions from the audience that I would like to bring to you. So one question is, who's providing the weapons for this conflict, to the combatants? Maybe Khulud?
Sure. I mean, the question is everyone. Sudan is a country that has so many resources. You have the Nile, you have the Red Sea, you have fertile lands that are irrigated by both rains as well as the Niles. We have 2 Niles in Sudan. They meet together in Khartoum and they go up to Egypt. So technically, I guess 3 Niles. You have, minerals and you have extractive metals like gold, etc. You have, of course, uranium. And so it's in a place like that, the combination of lots of resources plus very poor governance and very, poor structures of sort of government has never been a good combination. So what we have effectively is years and years and years of rule by an Islamist military regime. And once that goes, rather than take the opportunity to rewrite some of the wrongs that we've seen in Sudan, a lot of the armed actors, a lot of the military security regime of Omar al-Bashir effectively fought hard to push back as much as possible against that democratic will. They did not want to face any kind of justice mechanisms, any kind of accountability, which, as Hajju says, is very important. They didn't want to let go of their ill-gotten money they made during the Bashir regime. They didn't want to face any kinds of questions effectively from a public that through the revolution became very, very aware of just how much corruption, just how much violence the state had been meting out for decades against people in Sudan, whether they live in Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, or indeed in places like Khartoum. And so what you have there is effectively a recipe where, in order to push back against this sort of revolution, a counter-revolutionary war has come up. And this is how I see this war currently taking place. But you have within that counter-revolutionary war, different actors who want to, eventually to push back against the democratic will of the people, but they want different things inherently. And what that does is it invites different actors, particularly those in the region, to have to get involved, to pick from amongst the different belligerents in Sudan their favorite security guarantor. And that is someone who will ensure that their needs are met. And so for Egypt, that is the Sudanese Armed Forces. It always has been. Egypt is very concerned about losing access to as much Nile water as it is currently getting, particularly with the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. And so it supports the Sudanese Armed Forces politically and militarily to make sure that they come out on top. At the same time, you have countries like the United Arab Emirates who back the RSF. They say they have a stated anti-Islamist foreign policy in the region. That's not really borne out in Sudan and in other countries, but for them, the RSF is a better guarantor of their security and economic interests than the Sudanese Armed Forces, whom they see as, ridden with Islamist influence. And though that's true, the UAE's own engagement with the Sudanese Armed Forces really undermines that position. Within that, you have countries that surround Sudan, whether it's Eritrea, Ethiopia, Chad, Central African Republic, Libya, or South Sudan, who've all chosen a side. Most of them effectively facilitated the RSF's military strategies. Eritrea and Egypt are the only ones in the region in Sudan's neighboring countries that back the Sudanese Armed Forces. And then you have further afield the Arab states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who also back the Sudanese Armed Forces. You have Turkey that also backs the Sudanese Armed Forces. Turkey and Qatar, of course, have this penchant, this preference for Muslim Brotherhood regimes, and therefore they see their Sudanese army as the right vehicle to bring back that Muslim Brotherhood regime that we had under Omar al-Bashir. What all of these countries share, particularly the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, is they don't want to see a civilian, democratic political dispensation in Sudan because it makes it very difficult for them to then rob Sudan of its resources in the way that they're currently doing. If you have military actors who people do not want in power, particularly after the revolution, and who have to suppress their people in order to stay in power, it's those very actors that are going to want and really need international support. And they're willing to effectively do whatever it takes to make sure they get continued weaponry in the country, in this case, to fight this counter-revolutionary war. So you have Egypt, you have Qatar, you have Iran, you have all supporting, I have Turkey and Russia, all giving weapons of all different kinds to the Sudanese Armed Forces. And on the other side, you have the RSF, that is mostly, as far as we can tell, being given weapons by the United Arab Emirates, increasingly using Chinese-made weapons. And though they come mostly through regional countries that border the blue area in the map that you showed earlier. So countries like Chad, Libya, at least the eastern part of Libya, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. So as you can see, in order to unpick this war, one thing you'd have to do, of course, is stop the weapons from coming in, but you'd also have to stop the predatory foreign policies of countries in the region, and the other countries, sort of like Chad, South Sudan, etc., who perhaps have less political and economic power, but are nonetheless being made complicit in this war against Sudan civilians.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. Maybe a question to Naba, also a question from the audience, and I don't know if you can answer that. Someone asks, so if the RSF is against the regular army, why is the RSF accepted by so many people? Is it the case that the RSF is accepted and supported by people? Naba?
Actually, it's since the war started in April 2023, there was an intentional confusion about that RSF or about at least about their narratives, that they are representing the revolution and they want to get rid of the Islamic regime in Sudan. So a lot of people who believed that the Islamists who are hammering the democratic change in Sudan believe that narrative. But since day one, since RSF looted houses, occupied hospitals, destructed water and power plants, and of course, the first issue was occupying civilian infrastructure, and then they spread into Al Jazeera state and Central Sudan, and they made more atrocities against civilians, and they killed people, they destructed agricultural plants, they looted agricultural machines. Since that happened in the first few months of the war, all of their narratives has gone. But still, of course, there's some people who are supporting RSF, especially in the Darfur region. It started as an ethnic group, RSF itself, when the war started, but then a lot of people joined RSF and they are supporting them. Right now, RSF are reliant on the narrative that they are against the Islamist rule and they want to get rid of the Islamist rule and for Sudan government, and all of these narratives right now, of course, is having supporters not only from Darfur, but of course some political parties and some activists who joined their new parallel government. So we can't say that RSF doesn't have supporters, but with all of the atrocities they made against civilians in Al Jazeera state, in Khartoum, in part of Blue Nile, and of course in Darfur itself, we can say they lost a lot of grounds and they lost a lot of supporters, even between their sides.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
I agree with Naba's very good take on this. What I would say is that it differs from place to place. So I think people in the center very much feel the way that Naba has outlined. But we have to remember that this war is becoming increasingly ethnicized. So you have people from ethnic communities in the West, in Darfur, who don't support the RSF, but say they have no option but to support the RSF, because people who hail from the West and live in the central parts of the country, in parts where the Sudanese Armed Forces controls, are finding that they are under suspicion. Some of them are put through summary trials without any sort of rule of law, any due diligence being central to those processes, and some are put to death in summary executions. And so you have this real ethnicization of the conflict that is actually very intentionally done. I remember when the war started, I was in Khartoum, and a lot of people were saying in the first few weeks of the war, this is not our fight. We will let the RSF and the SAF sort this out, and we will stay out of it. But the RSF and the SAF, of course, realized this very quickly, that they would have very few supporters in a war that they started in the capital, in Khartoum. And so very quickly you started to see this ethnicized narrative come out from both the SAF camp and the RSF camp to pull people into their corners. And so what has happened now is that you have a lot of people from the north, the center, and the east of the country being pulled into the sphere of the Sudanese Armed Forces camp, and you have people from the west, whether they're Arab or African groups, etc., from the Kurdistans, from the 5 Darfur states, being pulled into the sphere of the RSF, whether they want to or not. Because right now, unfortunately, whether you are seen as a partisan, favoring one side or the other, whether you're seen as an enemy of the state or not in one part of the country or the other, only relies on your ethnic identity and not at all on what your political beliefs are, unless you are an Islamist, which is a different factor. And so people here, unfortunately, don't really have an option sometimes but to, if not support the RSF, at least not to go against them. So we have to be careful about how we sort of conceive of, what support to either SAF or the RSF looks like, but also the dangers of the continued ethnicization of this conflict that will make it so much more difficult to create a landscape of peaceful coexistence once this war actually ends.
Mm-hmm. A question to Carl and Laura. Down there where you have filmed, did you, except when you filmed in the hospital, did you have talks, or did you get a bit the feeling of people if they want to stay part of Sudan, or if they feel like they should be more autonomous or something like that? Because there's talk of a split up of the whole country right now. Did you get any information about that?
It was different. I mean, most people were saying they just want to have their peace and their freedom and their autonomy, and they want to have the same education as they have in the north. They want to have good schools. They want to have a functioning government. But actually, fewer than I thought said they want to be completely independent or autonomous. I mean, completely independent, but they just wanted the same rights as people in the north. That was the main stance what we got. And what was also interesting when we were there, it was before the RSF and the SPLM North had gotten together in Kenya and made a deal. And so people were very neither pro-SAF nor pro-RSF. And I think that has actually changed now. I mean, people spoke very openly to us about the atrocities that happened in Darfur, the refugees that came from there, and other things that happened. And also they didn't speak well, of course, about the SAF, because that's been a conflict for decades. But I think that has changed now. And I mean, we haven't been there, and it was difficult for us to speak to people. But what I've heard from people we've spoken to, they said it's now you have RSF soldiers in the area, and people probably are not as openly against or RSF now as they were when we were there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the Nuba Mountain there's an added complexity, because the Nuba have their own decade-old struggle against the central government. What I would just like to briefly add is I think the aim of the film was to give a sense of how ordinary people are experiencing this conflict. And I think they experience it on a different level. For many people in the Nuba Mountains, they could carry on with their lives, not exactly as before, but they haven't been that much impacted. But then, of course, as one will see in the film, we spent a considerable amount of time with refugees from Darfur who were on the road for months, fleeing violence. Their families been murdered. Their families, the surviving members of the families, being scattered all over the place. Some of them in Chad, some made the way south. With some, they lost trace altogether. What strikes me sometimes, and what I thought when I was there, is we've now been talking about all this complexity and all these outside interests, like Khulud said. You have neighboring countries, you have the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, etc. Everybody has sort of interests in Sudan and is in its own way fueling the conflict. And then you speak to people who are just trying to save their own lives or get enough food for their children or to carry on. And I often thought it's like, when I asked them, of course they do know and they do understand what is going on, but their most pressing need is just to have, as was said before as well, have stability and have security and have some sort of control over their lives and some sort of freedom. And this is sometimes really, really moving to see. You have these political interests on one side, and you just have really very human wishes and desires on the other side. But people are often very helpless in this, and they're just caught up in that storm, and they have to respond to it in order to survive. And this is one big part, actually, we wanted to show.
Mm-hmm. Kyle, when you were in Darfur, it's a bit difficult to imagine how the neighboring countries like Chad, which is a neighboring country, could be affected by the conflict and also by refugee movements. Is it a possibility that Chad, which is not so stable itself, could be destabilized by the conflict in Sudan as well?
I think the prospects about destabilization are pretty big for me to try to answer, but certainly we see impacts in all neighboring countries, right? You mentioned at the top of this session that we had, upwards of 15 million people displaced by this conflict by this point, and many of those people have more than 10 million are within borders, but millions have also tried to cross into neighboring countries, and that displacement continues. And so, when you have countries like Chad that are already significantly strained, whether that's resources or insecurity, then of course it's going to be ever more difficult and more challenging to launch the kind of response that you need. The other thing that it does is it creates, it kind of spreads where the resources for this crisis go, right? Of course, we have to look at it regionally. There needs to be sufficient resources allocated to neighboring countries. But when that becomes more feasible, then moving resources closer to the front lines, more into affected areas where you can get to higher concentrations of impacted people, then that becomes a deprioritized issue, or that is done just to a lesser degree because there are these other areas to work in. And so not only is it significantly difficult for the neighboring countries, but of course it also overall detracts from the resources that reach in to the country.
The Trump administration in the USA has cut down humanitarian aid a lot. European countries do the same, also Germany included. What impact does this have on your work for Doctors Without Borders, or in general on humanitarian aid for a country like Sudan?
Well, as MSF, we're very fortunate to receive the vast majority of our funding through independent private donations, and so we are relatively less affected, of course, but the humanitarian sector as a whole is going to and is in the process of taking a major hit as a result of these cuts, of course. You mentioned the cuts coming out of DC and the Trump administration in the White House, but also European donor states. The equally catastrophic cuts, or almost equally catastrophic cuts from a number of European donor states. And so there is a major reset occurring at the moment. Fortunately, programs in Sudan have been exempted from some of these cuts. However, because the sector as a whole is going to be taking a major cut, of course, a lot of the systems that organizations depend on in Sudan are also going to be impacted, whether this is the humanitarian air service flights run by the World Food Program or other logistical support offered by the UN. In this kind of funding environment, which was already difficult prior to all of these cuts, it's really incumbent that donors and those that are still putting money towards these crises do so with ever more priority towards local organizations. As Hajuj was also mentioning in the beginning, the emergency response rooms are a great example of the local civil society response, of a community-based solidarity network, which is how people are surviving, right? The international organizations such as MSF, even though we aim to scale, and now we work in 9 different states across the country, it's still a drop in the ocean relative to the needs that are there. And the way that people are going to survive, the way that they have survived, is largely or primarily through the support of local solidarity networks. And this is where, with less funding coming, the money that exists needs to be prioritized in reaching the local frontline providers of care.
Mm. Yeah, Hajuj, do you think that the grassroots caritative work like you're doing and is like making people more resilient to these cuts?
So these cuts are in the whole world, as was mentioned, and I think this idea of mutual aid, we call it mutual aid, like when the community themselves do it. And I think for Europeans, it's good to understand what happened during the time of COVID when you had to help your neighbor and whatnot. So this method of locally allowing part of the funding that goes to humanitarian aid and development and whatnot to go through the community itself is well researched. The people have been talking about it for 10 years. But I think this in Sudan, this is the highest level, the emergency response room. And what they did was for a lot of reasons. Part of it was the Sudanese culture. We already had something called Nafir. We had women co-ops. We had all this Sudanese culture. But I feel like the same happens in a lot of nations. When things hit and it's really bad, people go back. So I feel like with the US aid, with the cuts happening in Europe to try to spend more money on military and whatnot, so it is important for the whole world. What's happening in Sudan is something that should be learned, and I think there should be a movement in the world towards mutual aid and towards having not just the NGOs and whatnot, even the way the NGOs work. They need to alter it to work with the community itself, and I think this is becoming a major thing with less money. Definitely, you need a partnership. It cannot happen alone. Like, we do not have doctors. We need MSF to be there, but we could actually carry stuff, take care of some logistical stuff, take care of some of the basic needs of having a little clinic that we run. But when we need something like really harsh, then we need the support of organizations that have the skill level and whatnot. So I think there's this with what's happening in the world. There has to be a shift towards having partnerships with the community and making sure that some of the money goes directly to the community, but also supporting these international NGOs and organizations so they can do the work differently. But there has to be a mind shift for that to happen.
A question to Naba. When we, as we could look at the map, and this RSF is in the west and in the east, there's the army is stronger. Do you fear like this country could be split up in 2 parts? One under the rule of RSF, the other one under the rule of the regular army?
Actually, this year is right now it's a living reality since RSF announced the battle government, the formation of it, and they named their cabinet with all of names of the ministers and cabinet and sovereign council. So yes, even if it's not, it will not happen on the ground soon because of the complications on the ground in Darfur, that the region they want to make the foundation of the government there because of the domestic issues, security issues in Darfur, and even the complexity of the situation in Darfur there and the long conflict that will not allow a formation of the government ideally. But of course, splitting the country into 2 authorities and powers is possible. We saw that in Libya, and before that happened in Libya, it was for many people it was not possible. They were not seeing this. So it's part of making Sudan or splitting Sudan into smaller countries, into weakening the country, looting its resources, and of course controlling its political decision and its future. So even if this will not happen soon, it will be kind of a card that will push Sudan and the war into certain scenarios, and of course it will push Sudanese people to accept a reality that they don't prefer, like accepting RSF or their supporters in the future of the country. So yes, this scenario is possible. I can say it's not possible. As we saw right now, RSF right now is controlling 4 states out of 5 states in Darfur alone, and they are penetrating towards Kordofan. Yes, the Sudanese military regained control of Khartoum, Al Jazeera State, Central Sudan, and securing northern states and eastern parts of the country. But of course, because of the war and because of the continuation of the supporters, regional players, and international players to the war, we can't predict where the things shall go. But hopefully, nobody wants to see a country like Sudan with these rich resources. These resources is not only about water, gold, as Khulud said. It's not about only geographical or geopolitical position or location and water and gold. It's about the diversity of its human itself. Nobody wants to see this, but if the escalation will continue, if the regional and international players will assign the players to fuel the conflict in Sudan, if it morphs into a civil war or ethnic-based war, of course we will see a split Sudan, not only to Darfur and northern parts of the country, but the conspiracy is bigger to make Sudan weaker and make it into a smaller countries.
Khulud, you mentioned before the resources as interest also of international actors like the Emirates. What role does the gold in Darfur play? I read there's quite an amount of gold lying there, which now the RSF has mostly under control. Can you explore a bit about this connection?
Well, just before we, I think, get onto that, it's worth noting that for the Sudanese state in 2011, up to 2011, oil was the main revenue earner for the Sudanese state. But with the secession of South Sudan, with the independence of South Sudan in 2011, the government in Khartoum had to find a new means of maintaining its sort of patronage networks across the country, its clientelist state across the country. And gold very quickly became that resource. And so sort of overnight, Sudan went from being an oil-producing state to a gold-producing state. It's now the largest producer of gold in Africa, the third largest, producer of gold in Africa. And the rise of the RSF mirrors that trajectory. So the RSF sort of coming into their own as a sort of pseudo-formalized military entity were first brought into Khartoum in 2013. That was at a time just after the head of the RSF, Hemeti, had threatened to get into a rebellion against Bashir. And Bashir managed to placate him, to pacify him by giving him access to some gold mines in Darfur. And this is what got the RSF to become extremely wealthy very, very quickly, as well as, of course, selling them their soldiers as mercenaries in Yemen, in Libya, on behalf of the Saudi Emirati coalition, particularly in Libya. And so gold suddenly became this currency for a fast track to political power. And so the RSF have had control over a lot of gold mines, Jebel Amir, for example, in North Darfur, different gold mines in the Darfur region, as well as one of the most profitable mines in all of Sudan, the Songo mines in South Darfur. And they still have control over a lot of those gold mines. And so they have been able to establish networks, commercial networks, economic networks, not only in Sudan, but also across the Sahel and other sort of near neighboring areas, almost all the way into the Atlantic. For the Sudanese Armed Forces, gold is extremely valuable too, because as that had become, as of sort of 2011, 2012, the main earner for the Sudanese state, the gold mines in the Red Sea area, as well as in a sort of River Nile and Northern state, they became very, very important as an earner for the Sudanese Armed Forces. Almost all of that money is going into buying weapons. So a leaked document earlier this year from the Ministry of Finance in Port Sudan revealed that about 90% of the state revenue would be spent on the war, effectively weapons, artillery, bullets, etc., and only 10% would go to, quote unquote, services, but really that 10% would go into paying the salaries of civil servants, effectively to keep the idea of a government churning, even if no services were actually being, given. the RSF is following a similar model. With the pronouncement of this government a few days ago, they realized that the standard of providing government-like services is actually very low. So there's no reason for them necessarily, we're not going to see them spend a lot of money that they make from these gold mines on social services, on rule of law, on security, on famine relief, etc., or on sort of infrastructure more generally. But in many ways, the gold has become the currency of this war. And so there are a lot of people out there saying that, for example, Sudan's gold needs to be labeled blood gold, much in the way that diamonds from Sierra Leone were labeled blood diamonds, to get consumers to be more aware of the gold that they're buying. But gold, of course, can be melted down and reconstituted and shipped off like it is, mostly heading towards the UAE. And so it's very difficult to trace what is Sudanese gold and what isn't. The very important thing to note here about the gold is that whether it comes out of the Sudanese Armed Forces side to the east and north, or from the RSF side, or indeed from the SPLMN territory in the Nuba Mountains in South Kordofan, almost all of the gold produced in Sudan, as well as most of the gold is produced anywhere really, particularly in Africa, ends up in the United Arab Emirates. And so the UAE here is the big winner, as the people of Sudan are, sort of being starved, as they're being besieged, as they're being, whether by SAF or by the RSF, the UAE is a huge, is making a lot of money out of this effectively. And so there are a lot of countries that are, a lot of this gold is also being smuggled through Egypt. A lot, Egypt, which is not a big gold producer, announced, I think, a year and a half or so into Sudan's war, that it suddenly had, 103% or maybe up to 150% worth of gold production all of a sudden. Obviously, a lot of that gold would have been smuggled by the Sudanese Armed Forces and actually also by the Rapid Support Forces into Egypt. Egypt benefits from having gold in its foreign, in its for Federal Reserve, in its central banks, in order to prop up its ailing currency. So gold has also become the means by which foreign countries want this war to continue, because they're able to get their hands on Sudanese resources, in particular gold, for various reasons: to prop up the gold market in Dubai, to prop up the currency in Egypt, to evade sanctions, as Russia is doing, using Sudanese gold. It becomes very difficult to stop the flow of gold coming out of Sudan. The Sudanese Armed Forces has reported an increase of gold coming out of its areas. The RSF continues to be able to buy, sort of truckloads of weapons, plane loads of weapons through how much gold is producing. And because of that, finding ways of stopping the gold from leaving Sudan, both licitly and illicitly, would go a long way into curbing the potential of the different armed groups to continue prosecuting this war. But it's very difficult. We haven't seen any progress so far in terms of capturing that gold. There are also, just lastly, initiatives out there that are calling for the money that is being generated through Sudan's gold, whether it's coming out of SAF areas or RSF areas, to be put into sort of a trust fund for Sudan that would be able to fund, for example, the work that Hajouj and the emergency response rooms are doing, but the work that mutual aid is doing in general, particularly in light of the cuts from USAID, as well as some European nations, which was providing the lion's share of humanitarian aid in Sudan.
Mm-hmm. Before we try to explore a bit what kind of solutions might exist there, and now you said something about curtailing this kind of gold flow and the importance of gold. I would like to know from Laura and Carl, Sudan is quite a forgotten war, at least from a European perspective. Why?
I mean, just what I hear from around me, from people I know, I think it's just here it's too far away for the people. They know nothing about it, which is no excuse. And then I think it's you have the Israel-Gaza conflict, you have Ukraine and Russia. That's closer to the Europeans in a sense, and I think they just can't deal with another conflict. That's the feeling I get, and and it's I think that's
and it's we have been talking about it for more than an hour. It's a very complex conflict, and what we also have mentioned is the US and Europe cutting aid. Now, why are they doing that? I mean, the Europeans don't necessarily have to do that. The Americans started it, but the Europeans followed, and I think and I fear from a European perspective, we are entering an age where we are becoming more and more disengaged from what is happening in the world. I mean, for those who are living in Europe, George and me were having breakfast a week ago, and we were talking about it. But Germany and Europe is very inward looking, and we have become very, very involved with our own problems and obsessed with our own problems, and we are full of anxieties, and the anxieties, of course, are also stoked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also internal problems we have, economic problems, etc., etc. So I think it's very, very hard to get interest in Europe for these kind of conflicts. And you can only get interest in Europe for these kind of conflicts if you explain, oh, what does it mean for Europe? Oh, do we get more refugees in Europe? I mean, this is always like the argument, which, well, maybe not, I don't know. But if we live in a world like where this is the only valid question we ask, whether we get interested and involved in other regions, then I think it's not very promising. But even if you want the sole remaining superpower, the USA is not really is more and more disengaging from the world. And for us as filmmakers and journalists, it's also very, very hard to find the outlets. And thank you, for DW, we had that collaboration and to do these stories, because looking at the numbers is, I mean, it's immense. If we look at the numbers, what is happening in Sudan, it's mind-boggling. But again, for us as filmmakers, we went to that hospital because we were like, well, these are crazy numbers, hundreds of thousands of people, on the move, threatened by starvation, so many deaths, etc. What does that mean? I mean, and then you go to a hospital and it becomes more and more, it becomes a little bit more tangible. And the hope is to kind of in that way get people interested, and maybe through that route get governments into action.
Yeah, that's what journalists are hoping, that by their work there might be some impact, some change of behavior. But you mentioned the refugees and said, well, Europeans or maybe also in other countries, they might only react if they see a direct impact to themselves. So Kyle,
Exactly.
my question to you would be, there are already, I think, more than 1 million refugees in Egypt, but also in other countries, Sudanese fled to. Do you see that there might be a new kind of refugee movement towards Europe due to the conflict in Sudan?
I mean, we have already seen successive waves of the European Union kind of externalizing the border and pushing the border further and further away from the actual land border of the EU through policies and support throughout other regions and countries like Sudan. But I think that this is one of the most unfortunate ways in which we actually see attention brought to this crisis. It is unfortunate that sometimes the only way that we actually do get attention from certain donor states is because it's very apparent that they have become very concerned that the crisis might result in more people turning up at their border. And I think that this is, just to reiterate the point, I think it's a really unfortunate way in which we get there, because these are also donors that they are significantly invested in this response, even if it's marginal relative to their overall budgets, and it's not nearly enough in terms of what we need. We're still talking about tens of, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from some of these states. And I think we need to see more ownership over that. We need to see these donor states take more accountability for the impact of that funding once it does get released, and not in a way that makes it more constrained or more restricted, and it's even harder to reach the ground. But these budgets that are going to UN agencies or to other organizations need to be translated into action on the ground, which unfortunately we don't see too often, unless, again, it starts to strike fear into the capitals of donor countries.
Khulud, and then also the rest of you, what can be done? What would be a solution to the conflict, and who has the power to end the conflict inside and outside of Sudan? Or Naba, maybe first to you, because I don't know if Khulud could hear me. What do you think? What has to happen to find a way out of the conflict, to end the conflict, and to get to more peaceful Sudan again?
Well, there is many stages in order to solve the Sudanese crisis, because the crisis is not about April's war. It's a long crisis that resulted after decades of mismanagement, corruption, and of course the unparalleled development in Sudan generally. So the first thing to contain the crisis is to immediately stop hostilities against civilians and the besiege of the cities, especially Al-Fashir and Kordofan. This is regarding the fighting. Second thing, the decision of ending the fighting in Sudan is on the hands of the Sudanese people. The Sudanese people are the ones who will decide if they want to stop this war. And I mean here the political parties, the stakeholders, everyone who is seeing that the future is not about elongating the war in Sudan, of course, will participate in the resolution. But we can't say this. This is just a perfect answer if we are talking generally about fragile situation or chaotic situation in the wars generally. But the Sudanese war is has a special, we can say, criteria. Right now, while I'm talking to you about how the solution and who has the power, generally the power is on the Sudanese people. And the second thing, because we are talking about a bigger scale, of course, international community can push on the parties and regional players and international players who are fueling the war, who are benefiting from elongating the conflict in Sudan, who are benefiting from gold smuggling, from fueling civil war, and from dividing Sudan into two countries. And here I'm talking about international community can push on the non-regional and international players to immediately stop the support for like weapon support for that fuels the Sudanese war, especially the devastating situation in Darfur. If that happened, we can say that the two warring parties and all of the Sudanese people can at least talk about a possible resolution, but we can't say this amid, of course, accumulated interests in Sudan that wants to see the country splits, and of course we can't talk about that in the presence of regional interests that doesn't want to stop this war anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from the audience. It's maybe a bit tricky to answer, but I will frame it a bit differently. So the question would be, how many global superpowers and regional superpowers intervened in Sudan? I think it's many, but for example, like Russia, US, China, are they intervening, or what are the interests of those bigger powers, if they have any, in Sudan? Khulud, maybe.
Sure. I mean, I often think about Sudan's war as a global war taking place in Sudan. And that's because Sudan has, waterways that are very important for internationally. That's the Nile and the Red Sea, particularly the Red Sea, that mean that you have all of these different actors sort of vying for influence over who controls those waterways. So Russia is a big player on Sudan and has been for a while. They're very much supporting both sides. I don't think Moscow sees much of a contradiction in supporting both the SAF and the RSF, because it looks at Sudan not as one cohesive whole country, but as a place of several zones of influence and interest. So you have, it supports the Sudanese Armed Forces because it's interested in getting a nuclear naval base on the Red Sea. There are already plans to do so that were put in place by the former president, the dictator, I should say, Omar al-Bashir. And so it supports the Sudanese Armed Forces in order to get its hands on that nuclear naval base on the Red Sea. At the same time, it supports the Rapid Support Forces for its in favor of its Sahel interests, particularly linked to, Chad, the Greater Sahel, but also southern Libya, southern and eastern Libya, where after the Russians were nominally kicked out of Syria, they're now thinking of setting up a Mediterranean military base on the Mediterranean coast of Libya. And so you have, I think Russia is a good example of just how complex it can be. It's not simply as, this is a list of countries that supports the SAF and this is the list of countries that support the RSF. Israel, similarly, is in both sides of this. They support the SAF and the RSF in different ways. The UAE, as we've outlined, supports the RSF militarily, but economically, it is the Sudanese Armed Forces' largest commercial partner. Most of the goods produced in SAF-controlled areas go to the UAE. Most of the imports coming into SAF-controlled areas come from the UAE. So there's a sort of ties that are very difficult to unpick very cleanly. You also have, for example, countries that are much more focused on one side versus the other. As I said earlier, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, these are countries that are very much focused on the Sudanese Armed Forces and believe that the Sudanese Armed Forces would be the right security guarantor for them. And so I would say it's sort of concentric circles of support. There's no sort of clean line. But when it comes to superpowers, it really depends on what you mean by superpower. China has a much longer foreign policy. It looks, it thinks of foreign policy in terms of decades, if not a century, unlike very much European powers and Western powers that look at sort of every 4 to 8 years. And so China is willing to wait this out. It always favors the state. Many countries do. And so they gravitate more towards the Sudanese Armed Forces. China works through the state almost exclusively. It does not favor non-state actors. It wants to build its Belt and Road Initiative from Port Sudan through the very flat landscape of Sudan all the way to Senegal. And its plan is that once this war clears, it will be able to reinvigorate some of those plans for the Belt and Road Initiative. It's willing to wait out this war effectively and hasn't really gotten involved. Save for selling its arms to different actors, in particular the UAE, that also end up in RSF hands. So I think even if countries do have a certain preference, especially in the case of China, because of the international sort of global weapons markets and how borderless capitalism has become, it's not very, very easy for these countries to control how some of their products end up. I would say at the Security Council, you increasingly have countries, of course, Russia and China that have supported the Sudanese Armed Forces at the Security Council, particularly in regards to, pushing back against calls for famine declaration by the Sudanese Armed Forces, pushing back against any sort of human rights language that is being, the international community wants to enforce in Sudan, that is being blocked by the Sudanese Armed Forces at the Security Council in New York, as well as the Human Rights Council in Geneva, etc. But also the Security Council, you now have countries like Pakistan and Somalia that are also backing the Sudanese Armed Forces. They have, different sort of interests. And for Somalia, for example, it itself has a breakaway region of Somaliland. It doesn't want to encourage kind of breakaway fragmentation that the RSF is currently pushing for, as a sort of international principle, so as not to add greater support to the breakaway region of Somaliland and its own borders. It's a very complex international picture right now. Yeah. What we need to get towards is a situation where the international community agrees that this war continuing is a collective bad. Right now, we don't have that consensus. We have countries that profit from this. We have countries that sort of see the instability in Sudan as a way of continuing to have, a sort of a foot in the game that allows them to, sort of put their interests into play at some point, if not now, at least in the future. And we really need that global consensus to say this war is bad. It's creating a hotbed for terrorism, which a lot of countries are saying but doing very little about. It is creating, masses of suffering and displacement, which is affecting neighboring countries, especially Chad and Egypt. Again, we're not seeing much of a global coalition to make sure that areas are safe enough for people to return. We need a global coalition on famine. That is really, I think, the most desperate ask right now. If the Sudanese Armed Forces were, as the presumptive de facto authorities, to declare a famine today, there are famine protocols that exist that could be put into place that would surge aid into different parts of the country and save lives. That is not happening. And because of how fractured the international picture is the SAF and the RSF are effectively able to, get away with murder. In particular, if we look at what the RSF is doing right now, the starvation and siege of Al-Fashir, but also in the Darfur region, but also Kadugli and at Dilinj in South Kordofan. It is able to do so because we currently live in a world where countries with a lot of international backing, let's say Israel, are able to starve large amounts of people and get away with it. And the RSF is absolutely using that now new global norm in order to say, well, we can do it too. And that don't exist the kind of international norms that we had, let's say 20 years ago, such as the responsibility to protect, such as a penchant or sort of an embracing of, for example, international peacekeeping missions or international sort of missions that put in place, human rights safeguards, etc. None of that exists anymore. So it's sort of, everyone can be a cowboy. International legal norms have been, really trampled on by very powerful countries. And a lot of the global superpowers, particularly the United States, have effectively degraded so many of the human rights norms and international norms that it itself had helped set up in the post-World War II era. So it's very difficult now, I think, for me to see how the international community can rally together, especially with the fragmentation around which side they support in this war.
Okay. Question to Hajooj. Same topic. Does Europe, in your view, has any chance to mediate in this conflict or put any pressure on someone?
I mean, there's a lot of things. When Kyle was talking about pushing the border away from Europe, I just remembered when Khulud was explaining how 2003 we had the Janjaweed, and then 2013 we had RSF. In the middle, there was something called Haras al-Hudud, protecting the borders, and that was the Janjaweed themselves. And actually protecting the border was something that RSF was doing for a while. They were getting paid and trained and given drones and whatnot by the Europeans. That said, the guy who was actually within the negotiations that ended with Burhan from Asaf and Hemeti from RSF fighting was called Volker. He was German. So Germans have a role right now with the removal of US aid pushing back and whatnot. Germany is one of the biggest, I think it is the biggest funder, up to the last cut from the German government. So I don't know what's going to happen, but definitely Germany is playing a role. But I think, as Carl was saying, the role tends to be, whenever it gets really hot, just stepping back and allowing Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar to run the show. So I feel like what Khulud said was very clear. If the world comes to the point where this world needs to end, it is going to end. Like, there is a point where the world can do something, but the world is too divided. The world concentration is somewhere else, and that doesn't seem to happen. But I always, for me, coming from the grassroots, I always try to think about what can we do, like not put all the agency away from us. So I think there's a point of solidarity where regular people can do something, like mutual aid is happening in Sudan. A lot of the funding in the beginning came from the diaspora, but we also got a lot of funding from organizations like we had funding from foundations, we had funding from donations that was coming from Germany and the US. So I feel like it's important to have shows like this, to share the documentary, watch it, share whenever DW puts out a piece. They put out more than one piece about Sudan, to share it, to talk about it, to discuss it, to understand what's happening in Sudan, the conflict in the Congo and whatnot, to start like educating yourselves about it in like study groups or something, and also to donate, to make sure that your governments continue giving aid, continue engagement, continue talking about it, and start pushing back this narrative that no, let's not interfere, like pushing back narrative to what I think Khulud said. There is a famine that is not being declared because of a political reason, and this is a very solid, clear case where the famine, people are dying because of politics, and it's a political decision to allow people in Sudan to die, and that can stop by solidarity.
Okay, thank you. My last question goes to Carl and Laura. You saw a lot of atrocities or a lot of difficult places already, and you are journalists, you work upon that. But if you see that the world seems to be more fragmented, more conflictual, etc., are you still hope that your work as a journalist makes sense?
I think it's just it makes sense in the sense that you see like individuals who are finding hope, who are being helped. I mean, you can't make big changes, but it's small in that way. Maybe one person, somebody sees the documentary and one person, I don't know, finances the medical education for one of the protagonists. I'm just giving an example, but it's small things like that I hope for, but the big change, no. I mean, I'm not super hopeful that there are big changes. It's, yeah, I'm happy if it changes the life of one person, but not, yeah.
Carl?
I'm a little bit more analytical, and I would like to weave together what has been said here. I think these are all manifestations of a multipolar world. I'm old enough, I grew up in the Cold War. I'm in Bavaria here. If I look out of the window, I basically can see the Iron Curtain. And this is kind of how we were used to how the world was functioning. Things were going wrong. It was like an orchestrated concert, and there seemed to have been more structure, more stability, and more responses. But now we have this multipolar world where Europe is struggling with its own identity and is getting absorbed with its own problems. At the same time, you have players like Khulud explained so well, in the Gulf, who are getting more self-confident, who are getting into these areas, who are doing their politics. And like Hajjoj said, it's more important now that we educate ourselves about what is going on in the world and that we understand the complexities, and that, yes, on a grassroots level, there can be things done. I think it's very, very important, and that we don't, as we say in German, we don't put our head in the sand. But that requires to be active and to understand what's going on. And what was said as well is that the war in Sudan is a war where the whole world has a part. It's just playing out in Sudan. And I think we will be confronted with these situations in future more often. And for me as a journalist, again, it's like trying to explain it on an empathetic level, try to explain it on a level where humans can connect. And then we have you guys who can give us all the additional information. So this is maybe a hopeful note for journalists. As I say, I'm very practical here, but this is where I see our work in the future. And hopefully we can empower people and then find our way in this new sort of messy world that we are experiencing right now.
Thank you very much. Our 90 minutes are a bit over. Now 92 minutes we spoke and discussed. Thank you so much for participating in the discussion, and also for the audience out there to attend it. Yeah.
Can I quickly just, if people want to fund some of these heroic efforts that Hajjoj and others are doing, please go to Mutual Aid Sudan and Sudan Solidarity Collective, and you can fund and donate there.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that. I mean, when we can't look away. I mean, we can look away, but it's maybe not the best idea. And there are things that, even if we feel helpless sometimes, when we look at the world and look at media and all the conflicts everywhere, there are possibilities to be active. Of course, donate, for example, not look away and get informed, etc. So we have to hope that also in Sudan the conflict will find an end, hopefully very soon. And so it won't. Thank you so much for the discussion, and have all a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.